Development of this international network of neoliberal activists constitutes the second major development of the period. Academics, business leaders, journalists, and politicians all worked in tandem to establish free market capitalism as a legitimate policy alternative to the post-war consensus. The academic faction would produce neoliberal research in prestigious university departments, often with wealthy benefactors paying their salaries directly rather than the university itself. The business faction would then amplify that research through its recently established think tank network, which not only published this research prolifically, but also connected neoliberal academics with sympathetic politicians and journalists by hosting prestigious research conferences. A short list of the historic players in the neoliberal think tank network includes some of the most well-known think tanks in Europe and America, including the American Enterprise Institute, the Foundation for Economic Education, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Center for Policy Studies, and the Adam Smith Institute. The avalanche of activity generated by this network eventually succeeded in the creation of an enormously important cultural accolade, the Nobel Peace Prize in Economic Sciences. The prize was established through a donation to the Nobel Foundation by the Central Bank of Sweden in 1968, 67 years after the first Nobel Prizes were awarded in 1901. To date, the prize has been awarded to at least a dozen members of the Second Chicago School, including at least 5 former presidents of the Mont Pelerin Society. The third major development of the period was the gradual adoption of neoliberal economics by the conservative parties of the US and the UK. The conservative parties of both of these countries found themselves on the defensive following the New Deal in America and the groundbreaking I.E.A. reforms in Britain. Public programs like Social Security, the National Health Service, and other enduring examples of government activism were emblematic of the period. These social reforms were so popular and well entrenched that even the conservative administrations which followed them, specifically Eisenhower in the US and Churchill in the UK, were uninterested in attempting to roll them back. However, the conservative business elite viewed their unambitious leaders with disdain and sought out neoliberal scholars such as I.E.A. to devise a way to fight government interventionism and regain their control over labor. Through their collaboration, they created a potent stream of economic propaganda that flowed into the radical grassroots activism building against the conservative establishment. This was the era of Joseph McCarthy, the John Birch Society, Wallace and Goldwater, all of whom were attempting to resist the many societal transformations taking place in the post-war era. Despite their radical new conception of liberalism, neoliberals frequently claimed classical liberals such as Adam Smith and David Hume as their own, which created the appearance of a historical lineage that extended backwards before the 20th century and the rush towards collectivism. This appeal to tradition proved powerfully seductive to conservative parties, and in neoliberal economics, conservatism found the engine for its mid-century offensive. Though it required a fusion with the new conservative priorities, such as stalwart anti-communism, reverence for Judeo-Christian teachings, opposition to civil rights for non-white persons, heteronormative and patriarchal family structures, and anti-immigrant sentiment, neoliberalism successfully injected adrenaline into the downtrodden right-wing movements that had been struggling to assert their relevance since the Great Depression. Eventually, decades later, the combination of apocalyptic Cold War paranoia and tenacious economic stagflation created a sufficient crisis for conservatives, armed with neoliberal tools, to present a binary political choice between free market and in fact neoliberal capitalism and totalitarian communism, with no room for any form of embedded liberal capitalism in between. This led to massive electoral victories at the very end of the 1970s, when the post-war consensus was finally collapsing. Only the first development will be covered in this video. These 3 developments in the evolution of neoliberal capitalism, which took place in the shadow of the Cold War, were events with global repercussions. They were also events which, incredibly, went mostly unnoticed or ignored by the political and economic mainstreams of the time, and if they were acknowledged, they were never identified as neoliberal developments, but either as conservative or libertarian ones. The unhelpful dichotomy between liberals and conservatives that has persisted in our political discourse from the post-war era to the present day made the task of identifying neoliberalism's proximity to both conservatism and libertarianism extremely difficult. Additionally, the existence of different philosophical variants of neoliberalism, one of which actually did deliver positive economic recovery in West Germany, made the task of identifying the danger inherent in later forms of neoliberalism even more difficult. Under the cover of this widespread economic and political obfuscation, the indefatigable persistence of neoliberal champions like I.E.A. and others redirected the course of economics, politics, and history itself away from the conclusions drawn by Keynes and the social reformers of the early 20th century, and towards a new ontology of a society indistinguishable from a market process. Shortly after the conclusion of the Cold War, some thinkers even went as far as to say that the current neoliberal capitalist paradigm constituted the end of history. A greater testament to neoliberalism's assiduous dedication to the knowledge war is difficult to imagine.